Like the cobwebbed entrance to a forgotten tomb, the feed room door creaked open very slowly. David, his mind wandering through some parallel universe, his nose buried in a computer printout, shuffled absent-mindedly into the central office of Compact Cable. The single-spaced printout was 16 pages in length and contained only one thing: a single, incredibly long number, a continuous mind-numbing strand of ones and zeros, a binary mathematical representation of 20 minutes worth of mysterious, disruptive signal. His custom-built phase reverse spectrometer had done its job. The device had compiled a precise numerical portrait of the oscillating frequency and specified the mirror image signal that could be broadcast to cancel out the interference. Marty was going to be very happy. He could start pumping a clear picture out to their subscribers, then get on the phone and taunt the competition. But David wasn't finished. As soon as he'd figured out a way to block the signal, he started asking himself where it was coming from and what it meant. He was halfway across the office before he noticed it was empty. David glanced at the wall clock. Way past lunchtime, he told himself. Jack Feldon, an old-timer who worked in sales, was at his desk, sobbing like a baby into a telephone. In a vague way, David realized something was wrong, but he was so focused on solving the puzzle he ignored everything else. He was an obsessive puzzle solver, had been since he got hooked on the New York Times Sunday crossword at age 12. When the Genius puzzles came out in the Mensa magazine each month, he'd plow through them one by one until, an hour or a few days later, he'd cracked them all. This business about the repeating signal in the satellite feed was a real-life riddle David was uniquely qualified to decipher. After all, how many engineers were there with his practical and theoretical skills who could also put their hands on $50 million worth of high-tech communications equipment anytime they liked? He took the pages to his cubicle, slipped a disk into his desktop computer, and brought up a sequence analyzing program up on the screen. With a few flicks of his fingers, he created a representation of the transmission. On a hunch, he asked the program if the repetitions of the signal were precisely equal. Negative. It was getting shorter, slowly reducing itself down to nothing. But it wasn't losing any strength, and television reception was in the same shad shape it had been in all day. Curious. Assuming the signal was being sent for some intelligent purpose, why would it fade to zero? Very weird. It took David about 60 seconds to do the algebra. According to his calculations, the signal would cycle down to extinction and disappear at 2:32 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Okay, he said to himself. So what? Because he'd been locked away in the crypt of the feed room all day, he had no idea where the signal might be coming from. After deciding he probably wouldn't learn anything else until that night, he stood up and left the cubicle. It was time to deliver the good news. Marty's office was, as usual, a disaster area. Yellowing newspapers, take-out lunch containers, extra copies of the latest shareholders' report, and great heaps of unopened mail were piled on top of overflowing file cabinets. In addition to all the mess, there were 5 bodies crowded into the room, their attention glued to the television. David barely noticed them. He did, however, spot the only unoccupied seat and slid into it like someone might beat him to the spot at the last minute. He casually draped a leg over the arm of the chair. It took him a moment to pick up on the mood of frightened anxiety in the room. "I've got a lock on the signal pattern," he announced, "and we should be able to filter it out." "Huh?" Marty realized he was being spoken to. Then absently, "Oh, good. But here's the strange thing. If my calculations are right, and they usually are, the whole thing's going to disappear in about 7 hours anyway." When he didn't get any reaction, he looked up and said with emphasis, "The signal reduces itself every time it recycles. Eventually, it will disappear. Hey, are you listening? David, my God, Marty realized. Haven't you been watching this? This is terrible, David. What are you talking about? Look, it's right there. David wheeled around in his chair and saw a live picture from Australia. A giant plate of fire, 15 miles wide, was hanging in the sky over Melbourne. David's first thought was that there had been some sort of ecological disaster, the ozone reaching a critical state of frailty and erupting into spontaneous combustion. A moment later, he asked the same question everyone had when they'd first seen the thing. Is there a war going on? They don't know what the hell these things are, somebody said. Atmospheric phenomenon is the term they keep repeating. It's probably some kind of debris from an asteroid, a co-worker suggested. These things are falling all over the earth. Oh, will you please wake up and smell the coffee? Marty snapped at the man. They've said it about 100 times. They're not falling objects. They're moving too slowly. And some of them have started moving sideways. They're flying. They're fucking flying saucers, and this is the fucking invasion of the earth, okay? David hesitated for a moment, not knowing whether to laugh or shit his pants. The distressed faces of the others in the room confirmed that Marty was serious. Whoa, wait a second. David stood up unconsciously, waving the idea away. A sharp chill ran up his back, lodged itself into his brain, then erupted into a creepy variety of terror. Marty came around the desk and put a concerned hand on David's shoulder, then began filling him in on what little was known about the 36 phenomena. Suddenly, he pointed at the TV screen. David, look! Isn't that Connie? Following the strictures of the emergency broadcast protocol, every channel switched over to a live picture of the White House press room. An attractive woman in a white silk blouse stepped up to the microphone and began taking questions from the press. The sight of her immediately wrenched David out of his one drama and hurled him into another, more personal one. The woman was none other than Constance Marine Spano, his estranged wife. Emphasize that so far this phenomenon, while it has disrupted our televisions and radios, hasn't caused any lasting damage, and we have no reason to assume that it will. David watched her lips moving, but hardly heard the words. They had spoken only a few weeks before, but watching her now made him realize that they hadn't actually seen one another for a year. Even through all the signal disturbance, he knew that she looked different, a little older, a little more polished, and much further away. The president is in an emergency planning meeting at the moment, but he wanted me to assure each and every American, as well as all of our allies, that we will be prepared for any possible outcome. The important thing now is for people not to panic. A reporter shouted up to her. Why did you initiate the EBS? Connie, composed, congenial, responded. We have instituted the emergency broadcast system. As anyone who has called long distance or anyone who is watching us now understands, we're getting a lot of interference. The system helps ensure reliable communication links between government and military installations. That's all. David was the only person in the world who knew exactly when Connie was and was not bullshitting. She was telling the truth on this one. We have a fix on 4 different occurrences, she continued, that will soon appear over American cities. 2 are headed towards San Francisco and Los Angeles. The other 2 are on our eastern seaboard, moving toward New York and Washington, D.C. Marty smiled at Pat Nolan, an enthusiastic new employee who poked his head into the office. You guys, we found an old bomb shelter in the basement of this building. If any of you care to join us down there, we've got room for a few more, but I wouldn't wait too long. With that, he turned and walked out. Jeannie, one of Compact's copywriters, bolted out the door after him, trying to beat the others in the room downstairs for a spot. When she was gone, Marty shook his head. This is going to get very, very ugly. Burley's was a depressing, dilapidated beer joint just across the highway from the tiny local airport. The felt on the pool table was fried, and the thumbtack posters of busty chicks caressing power tools hung on nicotine-encrusted walls. Russell Case was perched on a bar stool, staring at his second scotch and water, waiting for a man to walk through the door and hand him $10,000. As soon as he'd landed at the Heavland, he'd gone to the office to find Rocky, the owner-manager of the 2-bit landing strip. Rocky was a terrible name for this obese, oily man, so obscenely overweight he looked like a prize hog. "How much you give me for the old plane?" Russell asked. $10,000, Rocky replied, half joking. Both of them knew an aviable 1927 de Havilland could probably fetch 75 grand. "All right, I'll take it," Russell said softly. "But I need the whole thing in cash. I'll wait for you at Burley's." With that, he had turned and walked away, knowing Rocky would pour himself in his Lincoln and race to the bank. But it had been well over an hour since their conversation, and Russell was ready to order another drink, even though he couldn't pay for the first two if Rocky didn't show up with the cash. The television set at Burley's was switched off, and Russell was the first customer of the day. Neither he nor the bartender knew about the catastrophe taking place in the skies around the planet. Nevertheless, the topic of conversation turned to UFOs when a trio of greasy mechanics from the airport walked in the bar. "Well, well, well, speak of the devil," said the largest and dirtiest of them. "We heard you had a little trouble this morning, Russ. Went up and dusted the wrong field?" The other two guys cracked up. Russell faked a smile and kept his eyes on his whiskey. "Don't laugh, you guys," the big man continued. "It ain't Russ's fault. He's still a little confused from his hostage experience." Once again, his two pals began to cackle like a pair of hyenas in overalls. One of them stopped abruptly and asked, "Hostage experience? What happened to him?" "Let the man drink in peace, fellas," said the bartender without much conviction as he slid their beers across the bar. But the leader of the Grease Monkeys was just getting started. "You mean he ain't never told you? Well, a couple of years back, our boy here got himself kidnapped by aliens and taken up to their ship. And the little fellers did all kinds of nasty experiments on him. Tell him, Case." "Not today, guys, okay?" "He's not talking now," the guy brayed. "But you just wait till he has a couple more drinks in him. We won't be able to shut him up. Hey, Russ, could you do us a favor?" he asked, glancing at his watch. "Would you get stinking drunk before we head back to work?" That brought out another round of laughs from his buddies. When the bartender went into the back for something, Russell stood up quickly and started for the door. As he passed the mechanics, their leader reached out and clasped him by the shoulder. In a mocking whisper, he said, "Hey, Russ, tell us the truth. When they took you up in their spaceship, did they do, any sexual things to you?" The blast of laughter that erupted from all three of the airport workers brought the bartender into the room. Russell, no small man himself, was calmly preparing to knock the mechanic's teeth down his throat when the long neon lights hanging from the ceiling began to shake back and forth. A deep rumbling noise, growing louder, came through the building's walls. Beer bottles began to dance across the bar, and the sound of glasses and bottles tinkling against one another grew louder in the dingy bar room. In California, that could only mean one thing: an earthquake. Their differences suddenly forgotten, the men ran out of the dark bar into the blinding midday glare of the parking lot. Something was wrong. Something about the way the ground was shaking. Something about the evenness of the noise. It wasn't like any tremor they'd experienced before. It was too smooth. Russell glanced up, but the sun immediately stabbed into his eyes, causing him to look down at the dusty asphalt. The dark border of an enormous shadow moved toward him across the parking lot. As it passed in front of the sun, the men were able to see what was coming. All at once, the mechanic screamed and took off in different directions. Russell stood his ground, his hands clenching into tight fists. One of the 36 phenomena was rumbling through the air only a mile or so off the ground. He studied the enigmatic pattern of the object's lower surface, knowing exactly what was happening and exactly who was inside the monstrous rumbling craft. The same frail-bodied, fast-moving freaks who had ruined his life years before. When Troy was still a baby and Russell was still in the business of restoring old planes, he'd stayed late at the hangar one night rebuilding an engine. It was a hot July night, so he'd left the rolling doors wide open. All of a sudden, he felt the strength go out of his body. His arms dropped to his sides and the wrench in his hand clattered to the ground. He couldn't understand what was happening to him. He thought he might be suffering a heart attack. His whole body had gone numb, paralyzed, except he was still able to move his eyes. A noise came from the open doors. Glancing in that direction, Russell saw a strange little figure leaning around the corner. It couldn't have been more than 3.5 feet tall. This creature had a large head like a yellow light bulb and 2 black eyes as lifeless as coat buttons. Gripped by sudden animal terror, Russell struggled against his rigid body, trying to make it run, but his limbs wouldn't respond. He looked back at the creature peering in at him, and after a few moments his panic began to subside. "All of this is quite normal. No reason to be alarmed," Russell told himself. "You will not be harmed." This idea repeated itself continuously in his brain until he realized that it was a message, a form of mind control being communicated to him by mental telepathy. The next thing he knew, he was sitting on the floor, leaning against something. The creature from the door was sitting directly in front of him, its sinewy arms wrapped around its bent knees, while others, perhaps a dozen of them, flitted in and out of his peripheral vision. They were doing some sort of work, moving with astonishing speed. The creature seated before him continued to cloud Russell's mind with reassuring feelings. This succeeded in keeping him calm until he noticed something glinting in a narrow container. It was a needle, about 6 inches long, which was apparently going to be inserted into his skull. As clearly as if it were spoken aloud, one of the creatures told him, "There will be no pain, no damage." At that point, Russell remembered thinking of his family, struggling to form the words that would allow him to beg for his life. Then blackness. The next thing he remembered was being far out in the desert, lifting off the ground. The landscape corkscrewed away as he lifted higher and higher into the air. Then the floor of a ship closed like an iris beneath him. He was in a small, dingy chamber. The dark walls around him glistened with moisture, creating the sensation of being inside the body cavity of a very large animal. He felt their tiny hands moving everywhere over his body. Only then did he notice he was stripped naked. Again he tried to plead with them, mentally howling to be released. Then the experiments began. Unable to resist, Russell lay stretched out on his back while they invaded his body with several instruments that resembled medical probes. At some point he remembered one of them lifting his head and laying it on its side so he could look out a window cut into the bottom of the ship. He recognized a vague outline of hills far below and remembered tears pouring off his face as the experiments continued until the whole side of his head was soaking wet. He was found the next afternoon wandering through the parking lot of a supermarket 90 miles from the airport, suffering from amnesia. He couldn't remember his name or his address, and it took him almost a week to recognize his own wife, Maria. When asked what happened to him, he said he'd been chasing a brace of jackrabbits through the desert and had gotten lost. It didn't take him long to figure out this was only a screen memory planted in his mind to camouflage what had really happened. He never fully recovered. Over the course of the next several months, irritable and depressed, he developed an obsession about reconstructing the events of that night, spending all of his money and energy pursuing those fugitive fragments of memory. He put himself in psychotherapy, underwent hypnosis, and traveled to meet others who claimed to have been taken. It was during these months that Maria began to get sick. Her skin turned blotchy and, at night, she'd get terrible headaches that sometimes developed into trembling seizures. By the time Russell looked up from his own problems long enough to realize how sick she was and drove her to LA for testing, it was too late. The same day she was diagnosed with Addison's syndrome, an easily treated deficiency of the adrenal cortex. She died in her sleep. As the vast, coal-black ship rumbled past overhead, Russell clenched his fists tighter. He wanted nothing more than to murder a few of the shifty little runts he thought were inside the ship. The object was moving north at about 200 miles per hour. By the time it had moved past, allowing the sun to beat down once more on the parking lot of Burley's, Russell was gone. In Washington, D.C., the first people to make a visual sighting of the oncoming ship were the tourists crowded in the observation platform at the tip of the Washington Monument. They began to stampede down the stairwell of the 555-foot structure, trampling everyone who didn't get out of their way. The first casualty was an 11-year-old girl visiting from Lagos, Nigeria. Although her father had to shelter her body under his, someone had stepped on her back while her head was resting on one of the steps. She was limp and unconscious when he finally got her outside, the last two people out of the building. The National Park Rangers, not knowing they were still inside, had already gone. The man looked down the grassy hill and saw people running as fast as they could in every direction. In the sky behind Capitol Hill, one of the huge black discs, still trailing wisps of smoke, was looming over the Maryland state line, rumbling closer. In vain, the man shouted to the people running past him, asking them where he could find a hospital for his daughter. No one stopped, or even slowed down. Thousands of confused visitors were pouring out of the Smithsonian and the other museums lining the mall. As they came outside and saw the disc-shaped gargantuan crawling along the sky, most of them panicked. Great herds of frightened humans were running in all different directions, crashing blindly into one another. Mothers separated from their children stood amid the chaos, screaming over and over the names of the little ones they'd lost. Some froze in their tracks, uttering profanities or calling out the name of God. Here and there, groups of strangers had clustered around trees at the sides of buildings, staring mutely upward. Many others had collapsed to the ground, some praying, others cowering with their arms thrown over their heads. Thousands more, armies of federal employees, came tearing down the granite steps of their workplaces, sprinting, elbowing their way toward the entrances to the underground metro system. The thing in the sky inspired an immediate, all-consuming sense of dread. An angel of death grinding inexorably closer. Less than a mile away, at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Whitmore was on the phone with Yashchenko, the Russian president. "Yes, I understand," he said to the translator on the line with them. "Tell him we'll keep him informed and that Russia and the United States are in this together." While his message was being translated into Russian, he looked up at Connie and rolled his eyes. "Okay. Tell him I said goodbye. Do svidaniya." "What was that all about?" Connie asked. "I don't know. I think he was drunk." Suddenly, the doors flew open and a frightened staffer bolted into the room. "It's here!" the woman shouted, leading the way to a set of tall windows that opened onto a balcony. Whitmore and Gray shared a look, then stood up and followed the excited woman to the windows. "Daddy!" Patricia Whitmore came tearing across the carpet toward her father with tears in her eyes. "You're supposed to be downstairs," her father snapped at her. But the next moment, realizing his mistake, he was down on his knees to catch the girl as she threw herself into his arms. Alarmed by the tense mood that had seized White House, Patricia had escaped from her babysitters. Whitmore picked the girl up and carried her to a quiet corner of the office, consoling her. When he turned around again, he noticed his entire staff standing frozen in place on the balcony. Still holding his little girl, he walked out to join them. The black mass of the ship was crawling low over the Capitol, almost on top of them. Its front edge came sweeping over the Anacostia River, casting a circular shadow 15 miles in diameter. Unconsciously, Whitmore tightened his grasp on his sobbing daughter, pulling her closer to his chest to shield her from the awesome, terrifying sight. Without realizing it, Connie and the others had taken hold of one another, hands and arms laced together, in order to keep their balance and stave off the deep dread the ship inspired. Only the Secret Service agents patrolling the edge of the roof remained detached, focused on the job of protecting their leader.
"Oh my God, what do we do now?"
Connie whispered. "I've got to address the nation," Whitmore said. "There are a lot of frightened people out there right now."
"Yeah?"
She looked at him.
"I'm one of them."
Having communicated nothing to the people of Earth except their arrival, the 36 ships fanned out over the globe's most populated and powerful cities, including Beijing, Mexico City, Berlin, Karachi, Tel Aviv, and San Francisco. In Japan, the citizens of Yokohama had watched a fireball splashing out of the heavens, then level off at 6,000 feet, a cauldron of boiling smoke. Out of the dense clouds, the clean front edge of the ship came plowing forward. The audacious scale of it staggered the thousands of people watching from the docks, then turned them into a screaming mob as the endless bulk of the ship continued to emerge. It had moved directly over their heads, plunging the great port into a quaking, artificial twilight for several minutes until it moved away to the north. It was still visible from the rooftops, hanging in the air 40 miles away over the nation's capital, Tokyo. In Yokohama Central train station, the mood had calmed considerably once the object was no longer directly overhead. People loaded down with personal belongings jammed onto the platforms, waiting impatiently for the trains they hoped would carry them off to the safety of the countryside. Transit officials in blue uniforms and white gloves stood on crates above the throng, blowing whistles and urging the crowd to cooperate. Visible through the plexiglass walls, a battalion of American soldiers from the nearby base were trotting down the street in formation toward an unknown destination. For the moment at least, the evacuation was proceeding in an orderly fashion. The same scene was repeating itself in cities around the world. 1 of every 5 people on Earth found themselves trying to get out of the cities, great hives of humanity, only to learn what a tiny fraction of them could be accommodated by all of their roads, trains, and subways. As they stood waiting, sardined onto loading platforms, crowded at bus stops, or stacked into the backs of pickup trucks, they were having the same conversation in every conceivable language. Who or what was inside these gigantic ships, and what were their intentions? Their sinister exteriors convinced the vast majority of people that they had not come for an exchange of gifts and ceremonial handshakes. Still, many remained optimistic. The advanced technology of the ships, they argued, suggested a correspondingly high degree of evolution. Perhaps the extraterrestrials inside were representatives of a higher form of civilization. They would certainly be able to teach us many things about the universe. The optimists compared their situation to that of Stone Age humans on some undiscovered island who looked up and saw an airplane circling overhead. Terrified, they might naturally assume the world was ending when the crew of the airplane was there merely to satisfy their curiosity and thirst for discovery. Arguments such as these usually led to the depressing admission that humans had never gone anywhere merely for the sake of curiosity. The people who had first populated North America had slaughtered the American Indians. The Spaniards wiped out the Incas with prisons and disease. The first whites to visit Africa were slave catchers. Whenever humans had discovered a new territory, they had turned it into a conquest, subjugating or killing those who were already there. Everywhere, the prayer went up that the newcomers would treat humans in a more civilized way than they had treated one another.